In the year 1834, San Luis Potosí was a city balancing between tradition and transformation. The cobblestone streets echoed with the sound of horse hooves and street vendors calling out their goods. Church bells marked the passing hours, and in the cool mornings, the air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the panaderias. This was a Mexico still young, still finding its identity after independence. Education, especially for girls, was a rare privilege often reserved for the daughters of the wealthy, and even then, focused less on expanding the mind and more on preparing a young woman for marriage. But for the elite families of San Luis Potosí, one institution seemed to promise something different: El Colegio de Santa Maria de los Virtudes. The school's stone facade stood proudly in the heart of the city, its arched windows catching the sunlight and its tall wooden doors always polished to perfection. To an outsider, it was a place of discipline, piety, and learning, a sanctuary where young women could be shaped into refined, educated ladies. Inside its walls, daughters of merchants, landowners, and government officials would study reading, writing, arithmetic, music, embroidery, and the moral sciences. Parents trusted the school because it was run under the supervision of devout Catholic women who promised to guide their students with firmness, faith, and motherly care. It was said that once a girl entered the Colegio, she would emerge years later a picture of virtue, a daughter who could converse intelligently, manage a household, and bring pride to her family's name. This was the dream sold to the people of San Luis Potosí. For many parents, sending their daughters here was a way to secure not only education, but also protection from the chaos of the outside world. Life inside the school followed an unchanging rhythm. At dawn, the ringing of a small brass bell summoned the girls from their narrow beds to the chapel for morning prayers. After breakfast, classes began. Rows of wooden desks filled with neatly dressed students, their hair braided tightly, their eyes lowered respectfully as lessons were given. At midday, the girls gathered for a simple meal in the dining hall, and in the afternoons, the sound of piano practice and soft voices reciting French verbs floated through the corridors. From the outside, there was nothing to question. Teachers maintained a strict but fair order, and the students' manners reflected the discipline of the institution. The headmistress, Senora Mercedes Villalobos, was a tall woman with an unyielding gaze and a voice that could silence a room. She was respected by the city's elite, often invited to social gatherings and known for speaking eloquently about the importance of educating women to strengthen the moral foundation of the nation. But as with many places that look perfect from a distance, the truth lived in the shadows. Behind the whitewashed walls and orderly routines, there was a side of the Colegio that no outsider was meant to see. Some students whispered about the East Wing, an area of the building rarely visited by the main classes. They noticed that certain girls, usually orphans or those sent by distant relatives, seemed to vanish after only a few weeks at the school. Teachers explained that their families had taken them home or that they had been moved to other opportunities. But no letters arrived, and no one ever saw them again. The parents of the wealthier girls paid little attention to these disappearances. After all, their daughters were safe, and the school's reputation was unblemished. In a society where appearances meant everything, questioning an institution tied to both wealth and religion was unthinkable. But for Isabella Torres, a bright 15-year-old student with a curious mind and a keen sense of justice, there was something unsettling about the Colegio's silence. She had been sent here by her merchant father, who believed the school would give her the refinement necessary to marry into a more prominent family. Yet, instead of feeling inspired by the order and devotion around her, Isabella began to sense an invisible tension, as if the walls themselves were holding back secrets. She didn't yet know that she would become the one to pull those secrets into the light. She didn't know that her education here would not only teach her to read books, but also to read people, to recognize the difference between truth and lies dressed in fine clothes. For now she sat at her desk like every other girl, copying her lessons in perfect script, saying her prayers when instructed, and curtsying politely to the teachers. But somewhere deep inside, a question was forming, one that, in time, she would not be able to ignore. The Colegio de Santa Maria de las Virtudes had been built to shape the future of young women, and in its own way, it would shape Isabella's future, though not in the way her father, the headmistress, or even Isabella herself could have imagined. It would not only test her mind but her courage. It would teach her that the appearance of virtue can hide the deepest wrongs, and that sometimes the greatest lesson in life is learning when to stand up, speak out, and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The Colegio de Santa Maria de las Virtudes had rules for everything: where to walk, how to sit, when to speak, even how to breathe during prayers. Order was sacred here. The teachers liked to say that discipline was the foundation of a woman's virtue. And yet, beneath the surface of this neatly arranged world, there was something that could not be controlled: whispers. They floated through the corridors like invisible threads, weaving from ear to ear. They started quietly, a few hushed words exchanged when the teachers' backs were turned, a fleeting glance between older students that seemed to carry meaning no one else understood. But in a place where gossip was forbidden, even the smallest whisper felt dangerous. Isabella Torres noticed them almost immediately. She had only been at the school for a month when she began to catch pieces of these murmured conversations. They often happened near the east wing, that long, dim hallway where the sunlight struggled to reach, and the air always seemed a little cooler. The doors there were usually locked, and the windows had thick curtains that never seemed to open. One afternoon, as Isabella lingered after her French lesson to pack away her notebook, she overheard two girls talking in hurried tones. They took her there again. One whispered, "Are you sure?" The other replied nervously, "Maybe she's just ill. That's what they always say." The sound of approaching footsteps made them scatter before Isabella could ask what they meant, but the seed was planted in her mind. Who had been taken? And why? Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew louder in her awareness. Names she didn't recognize, mentions of girls who had gone home, but whose families never sent word. Stories of strange sounds at night, muffled cries, hurried footsteps, the creak of doors opening in the east wing when the rest of the building was asleep. One of the youngest students, a timid 12-year-old named Mariana, seemed especially troubled. Isabella noticed her in the dining hall one evening, barely touching her bread. When asked if something was wrong, Mariana hesitated, her eyes darting to the nearest teacher before she leaned closer. "She was my roommate," Mariana whispered. "She disappeared last week. They said her aunt came for her, but she left without her things and—" Her voice dropped lower. "I heard her crying the night before she was gone." Isabella felt a cold unease settle over her. It was easy to dismiss rumors as childish fears. Schools were always breeding grounds for ghost stories and secret tales, but this felt different. The fear in Mariana's eyes was real. The tightness in her voice was not the invention of an overactive imagination. The more Isabella listened, the more she realized the whispers were not random. They were warnings, coded messages passed carefully between those who dared to speak. No one ever said too much in one place, but if you pieced the fragments together, a disturbing pattern emerged. Girls without strong family ties, orphans, distant relatives, those from poor provinces were the ones who vanished. They were sent to the school under the promise of charity and education. Then one day they were gone. No farewells, no letters, no explanations beyond polite lies. The teachers never addressed these disappearances. The headmistress, Senora Villalobos, dismissed any questions with a wave of her hand. "It is not your place to worry about such matters," she would say. And in a society where obedience to authority was drilled into every girl's mind, most students accepted her word, but not Isabella. She had been taught by her father to think critically, to look for truth beneath appearances. And now she could feel the truth pressing against her, something hidden, something the school worked very hard to keep from the light. She began to make small observations, which teachers had keys to the east wing. Which nights the footsteps were heard, which girls looked pale and anxious before they disappeared. She never asked questions directly. Doing so could mark her as a troublemaker, and troublemakers rarely lasted long here. Instead, she watched, listened, and remembered. The whispers in the hallways were no longer just background noise. They had become a secret language, and Isabella was learning to speak it. It would have been easy to ignore it all, to tell herself that the school's affairs were none of her business. Many girls did just that, reasoning that as long as their safety was intact, what happened to others did not matter. But Isabella knew that safety built on someone else's suffering was no safety at all. And so, she made a quiet promise to herself she would find out the truth, even if it meant stepping into the shadows where no one else dared to go. The whispers were warnings, but they were also invitations to open doors that had been shut for far too long. Isabella was beginning to understand that the real education she would receive at the Collegio would not be in her books. It would be in courage, in persistence, and in the ability to listen when others were too afraid to speak. Because sometimes the smallest whispers in the hallway carry the loudest truths. The east wing of the Collegio de Santa Maria de los Virtudes was unlike any other part of the school. The rest of the building was filled with whitewashed walls, open courtyards, and the sound of girls reciting lessons. But the east wing seemed to exist in a different world, darker, quieter, and untouched by the daily rhythms of life. It was here, at the very end of the longest hallway, that the forbidden door stood. It was made of heavy oak, darkened by age, with an iron lock that looked like it belonged on a prison cell. Above it, the plaster on the wall was cracked, as if the building itself had tried to shrug the door off. The windows nearby were covered with thick velvet curtains, so the hallway was always dim, even in the brightest part of the day. The rules about it were simple. Do not go near the east wing after sundown. Do not attempt to open the door. Do not ask questions about what lies behind it. For most students, that was enough. In 1834 Mexico, a young woman's duty was to obey without question. Fear kept them away as effectively as the lock did. But for Isabella Torres, fear had never been a reason to turn back. It had always been a reason to look closer. Her curiosity had been growing since the day she arrived. The whispers she'd heard in the hallways, the missing girls, the hurried steps at night, they all pointed toward this door. One evening, after evening prayers, Isabella lingered near the east hallway under the pretense of helping Sister Magdalena gather hymn books. As the rest of the students filed toward the dormitories, she stayed behind. The school was settling into its nighttime stillness, the sound of cutlery being washed in the kitchen, the faint clatter of shutters being closed. She waited until Sister Magdalena disappeared around the corner before she crept toward the forbidden door. As she got closer, she noticed things she hadn't before. The faint smell of something metallic, almost like blood, mixed with a medicinal scent that stung her nose. She pressed her ear to the door and heard nothing, only her own breath, quick and shallow. Then, faintly, there was a sound, not footsteps, not voices, but a slow, steady dripping. Her heart pounded. The urge to try the handle was overwhelming. She reached out, wrapping her fingers around the cold iron knob, and turned. It didn't budge. She expected that. The door was always locked, but as she pulled her hand away, she noticed the wood was warm in one spot, as if someone had been leaning against it from the other side not long ago. Just then, she heard footsteps echoing from the far end of the hall. Quick, purposeful, she ducked into the nearest alcove, holding her breath. It was Senora Villalobos, the headmistress. She walked straight to the door, removed a large brass key from the folds of her skirt, and unlocked it. The door opened with a groan, revealing only a sliver of darkness inside. Before Isabella could see anything more, the headmistress stepped in and shut the door behind her. Isabella waited. Minutes passed. Then the door opened again. This time, Senora Villalobos emerged carrying a small covered lantern and something else, a bundle wrapped in white cloth, about the size of a newborn child. She held it tightly against her chest, her face pale and expressionless. Without a glance around, she locked the door again and disappeared down the hallway. Isabella remained frozen in the alcove long after the headmistress was gone. Her mind raced. What was inside that room? Why had the headmistress been carrying something so carefully, so secretly? And why did the rules of the school feel less like guidance and more like chains keeping the truth buried? That night, lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. The image of the headmistress with the bundle replayed over and over in her mind. Every instinct told her that whatever was behind that door was the key to the disappearances and to the uneasy whispers that haunted the school. But she also knew this. Danger wasn't something you rushed into. In life, the people who uncovered the deepest truths were rarely those who barged in blindly. They were the ones who moved with patience, gathering information, preparing themselves. The forbidden door was more than just a mystery. It was a test of courage, of persistence, and of the belief that truth, no matter how ugly, was worth seeking. Isabella decided she would not act yet. She would wait, watch, learn, and when the time came, she would open that door, not just for herself, but for every girl whose voice had been silenced within these walls. Because some doors aren't just locked with iron. They're locked with fear, and fear can only be undone by someone brave enough to turn the key. The Colegio de Santa Maria de los Virtudes had been built on a promise. At least, that was what every girl was told when she entered its whitewashed gates for the first time. They were told it was a place of moral instruction, of Christian devotion, of preparing young women to become pillars of virtue in their homes and communities. The walls were lined with paintings of saints, the air was filled with the scent of incense, and the halls echoed with the sound of prayers. From the outside, it was an image of holiness, but Isabella Torres had begun to understand something dangerous. Holiness can be worn like a mask. Her weeks of observation had revealed cracks in the school's carefully polished image. She noticed how certain students, the most outspoken, the ones who resisted rules or asked too many questions, suddenly left, without farewell letters or explanations. She noticed how the headmistress kept a small ring of keys hidden under her cloak at all times, keys she never allowed anyone else to touch. And she noticed how the same students who arrived bright, tied and full of life would, over time, become pale, thin, and withdrawn, as if the joy had been drained out of them. But the true breaking point came one rainy afternoon in September 1834. The sky was the color of slate, and rain lashed against the windows with a steady fury. Classes had been cancelled for the day, so the girls were sent to the chapel for extended prayers. Isabella, however, managed to slip away under the excuse of retrieving a forgotten Bible. She took the long hallway toward the east wing, the hallway of the forbidden door. When she reached it, the air was heavy with a damp, metallic smell again, and then she heard voices, low, urgent voices. She pressed herself against the wall just beyond the doorway and listened. "She won't survive another week." A woman's voice said, "It doesn't matter." Another replied sharply, "Once the papers are signed, the family will send the donation. The rest is God's will." There was a pause. Then the sound of something scraping across the floor. Isabella's breath caught. These weren't the words of nuns tending to the sick. These were transactions, cold and calculated. She peeked just far enough around the corner to see a sliver of the room beyond the door, lit dimly by a single oil lamp. What she saw froze her in place. On a narrow bed lay a girl no older than 15, her skin pale, her eyes closed. A rosary was clutched loosely in her frail hand, but there was no peace on her face, only exhaustion. Beside her, a nun was adjusting something on a small wooden table. Isabella realized with horror it was not medicine, but a stack of documents, along with a heavy leather purse. She understood now, the school was not merely a place of learning. For the most vulnerable girls, the orphans, the ones with no family to speak for them, it was a place where their lives could be traded for financial gain under the cloak of piety. Isabella's stomach churned. The prayers, the sermons about humility and sacrifice, they were all part of the disguise. Here, behind locked doors, the very people who preached charity were exploiting the innocent. Her instinct was to run, to get as far away from that wing as possible. But then she thought of the girl on the bed. She thought of the girls who had already disappeared. And she thought of her own younger sister, safe at home for now, but vulnerable in a world where appearances could hide cruelty so easily. Piety without love was nothing more than theater, and sometimes the people who appeared most righteous were the ones you should trust the least. That night, as the rain continued to fall, Isabella lay awake in the dormitory. She realized she was faced with a choice that would define who she truly was. She could remain silent, blending in with the other girls, keeping her head down until her own time at the school was over. Or she could find a way to bring the truth into the light, knowing it might cost her everything. Fear whispered that she was only one girl against an entire institution. But another voice, quiet yet steady, reminded her that change always starts with one person willing to speak when everyone else is silent. The school's reputation might have been built on piety, but the truth beneath it was rot. And rot, no matter how deeply hidden, cannot last forever under the light. Isabella made her decision. She would not let the mask remain unchallenged. She would not let the voices of the missing be erased. She would find a way to make the truth known, and in doing so, she would turn the very fear meant to control her into the strength that set her free. The rain had not stopped since that afternoon. It drummed against the roof of the dormitory like an impatient warning, as if the heavens themselves were urging her to act. Isabella lay on her narrow cot, staring up at the wooden beams above, unable to shake the image of the pale girl in the forbidden room. Every detail clung to her: the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the way the rosary slipped through her fingers, and the cold, businesslike exchange between the women standing over her. She had uncovered something vile. But now came the question that mattered most. What was she going to do about it? Her mind was a storm. Logic told her to stay quiet. After all, what could one girl do against an entire school, especially one with powerful allies in the church and local government? Speaking up could mean expulsion at best, and something much worse at worst. She could be labeled a liar, her family shamed, her sister denied any chance of education. In 1834, girls were taught to obey, not to challenge authority, especially not holy authority. And yet, silence felt like betrayal. She thought about the girls who had vanished before. What had they felt in their last days at the school? Did they realize what was happening to them? Had they begged for help that never came? Each unanswered question weighed on her chest like a stone. That night, while the other girls slept, Isabella whispered a prayer into the darkness. Not the memorized kind the nuns recited each morning, but a desperate, unpolished plea. God, if you gave me eyes to see this, give me the courage to do something about it. When morning came, her course was set. She began by confiding in one person she trusted, Sister Lucia, the youngest nun at the school. Lucia had always been different from the others, offering quiet smiles and small acts of kindness that felt genuine. Isabella caught her alone in the laundry room, the sound of water and scrubbing covering their voices. At first, Lucia's face went pale with fear when Isabella told her what she'd seen. She tried to hush her, glancing toward the door. "You don't understand, child," she whispered. "This school belongs to people who cannot be challenged. If you speak, they will make sure no one believes you. Worse, they will make you disappear as they have with the others." But Isabella did not back down. "If no one speaks, they will keep doing it, and the girls who come after us will never stand a chance." Something flickered in Lucia's eyes, a mixture of fear and admiration. She didn't promise to help, but she also didn't walk away. That was enough for now. The next step was harder. Isabella wrote a letter to her father, careful to describe what she had seen without sounding like a reckless child making accusations. She knew she had to make him believe her and make him act before the school intercepted the letter. She folded it tightly, tucked it inside the lining of her prayer book, and waited for the right moment to slip it into the outgoing post. But fate, as it often does, tested her. 2 days later, the headmistress summoned her to her office. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. The headmistress's gaze was sharp, her fingers tapping on the desk. "I hear you have been wandering where you shouldn't," she said. Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. "I was looking for my Bible." The headmistress smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Curiosity can be dangerous, my dear. Some doors are closed for your own protection. Remember that." It was not a warning. It was a threat. When Isabella left the office, she knew 2 things. The headmistress suspected her, and her time was running out. That night, she acted. She snuck into the chapel, where the locked box for charitable donations sat by the altar. Beneath the false bottom, something she had noticed months before she hid her letter. She knew one of the town's honest priests would collect the box in the morning. With luck, he would find the letter and deliver it to her father. As she walked back to the dormitory, her hands trembled. She had taken her stand, small as it was. Whether it would save the girl in the forbidden room or expose her to danger, she didn't know. But she knew one thing with certainty: she could not live with herself if she had done nothing. Sometimes the right choice is not the safe choice, and in that rain-soaked week of 1834, Isabella Torres, a 16-year-old girl with nothing but her voice and her conviction, chose courage over comfort. And that choice would change everything. Decades have passed since the rain fell on the tiled roofs of the San Luis Potosí girls' school, since the footsteps of nuns echoed down the long, dim hallways, and since a teenage girl named Isabella Torres stood in defiance of silence. The building itself no longer exists. Time and progress have claimed its bricks, its chapel, and the garden where the students once prayed. But what happened there has not vanished, because some truths don't fade. They cling to the air like smoke, lingering in the collective memory of those who dare to speak them aloud. Isabella's decision to act, to risk her safety for the sake of others, might have seemed small at the time. She was not a soldier on a battlefield, nor a leader commanding crowds. She was just one young girl with no authority and no guarantee that anyone would believe her. And yet, she acted anyway. That, perhaps, is the heart of the lesson. The world often tells us that courage belongs to the powerful, to the ones with influence, resources, and titles before their names. But history quietly reminds us, again and again, that change often begins with someone who has none of those things. Isabella's story survived not because she exposed every detail in the moment, but because she planted a seed. Her father's arrival weeks later, his confrontation with the local diocese, and the slow unraveling of the school's reputation were not instant victories. The process was messy, dangerous, and incomplete. Many wrongs were never made right. But the seed she planted, the act of breaking silence, ensured that others would water it, tend to it, and let it grow. In every generation, there comes a moment when someone sees something they cannot ignore. Sometimes it's an injustice hidden behind polite smiles. Sometimes it's a wrong that everyone else has decided is not their problem. And in that moment, each of us faces the same question Isabella did. Will I speak or will I stay silent? The easy choice is always silence. Silence keeps you safe. Silence keeps you liked. Silence keeps the waters calm. But silence also lets darkness grow unchecked. The lesson that lingers from 1834 is this: your voice matters more than you think. Even if you are young, even if you feel powerless, even if you know the price of speaking could be high, your refusal to remain silent can become the turning point for someone else's freedom. It is also a lesson in the reality that doing what is right does not always look like winning. Isabella did not defeat the school in a single day. There were still those who denied her claims, still those who called her a troublemaker. But she could live with herself, and sometimes that is the only victory that matters in the moment. The rest follows in time. Today, we live in an age of constant noise, news headlines that flash and vanish, viral outrage that fades in days. But beneath all that noise, the old pattern still exists. Wrongs hidden behind closed doors, truths that people fear to speak, power used to protect the guilty instead of the innocent. And the question remains, will someone be willing to act when it's easier not to? The story of San Luis Potosí is not just about one girl in 1834. It is about the universal, timeless truth that someone, somewhere, is always standing at their own forbidden door, deciding whether to open it. When we remember Isabella, we are not remembering a perfect hero. We are remembering a person who was afraid, who doubted herself, who understood the danger, and who acted anyway. That is the kind of courage ordinary people can hold. That is the kind of courage that does not vanish with the years. The rain that fell on that school more than a century ago has long since evaporated, but the ripples from her choice are still here. They are in the people who speak when their voices shake. They are in the hands that lift the latch on a closed door. They are in the letters sent, the whispers shared, the quiet but unwavering acts of defiance that history may never record, but which still matter. And perhaps that is the truest measure of impact, not in statues or monuments, but in the quiet way one person's courage becomes another person's permission to be brave. That is the lesson that lingers.